Hello everyone. Okay, I hope we're all well and happy. What we're going to do today is the first lesson on the new topic, which is called Russian Economic and Social Change. It's on Moodle, the booklet. I think the section on Moodle is actually called like the impact of social and economic change or something like that. But the booklet's quite obvious on that. What this topic area covers is agricultural changes and conditions of the peasants under the Tsars and the communists. It covers industrial changes and again the working conditions of industrial workers and the working class under the Tsars and the communists. It then looks at society, so there's things like education and culture, and a little bit about religion as well. What me and Liz are planning to do is to make sure that by the time you all start in September that we've done all the peasants and agriculture side to it. So when we start in September we can get cracking on the industrial side. So with that in mind, what I plan to do is this week to do the peasants under the Tsars and agriculture under the Tsars, and then next week at the same time doing your one-to-ones. Don't worry about my workload. We'll do the same under the communist rulers. So by this time next week, or the end of next week, we should basically have hopefully wrapped up agriculture and all the rest of it. I feel like I should release an essay on that as well, but we'll come to that later on. Okay then, so what we're going to look at today then is the conditions of the peasants and stuff. And the first thing we're going to do, in your booklet you'll notice there's a nice picture on the first page called "How did the Tsars deal with problems of agriculture and rural communities?" Okay, so if we turn to that page, I'll pop onto a PowerPoint now the picture, and we'll have a chat about the points to put onto that page. Okay, so hopefully a lot of this should be quite familiar to you after doing all that stuff about Alexander II and the emancipation of the serfs, which of course is a big part of this bit about agriculture under the Tsars and peasants under the Tsars. As if you look at that page, you've got this first question: what were the main problems facing Russian peasants and agriculture under the Tsars? And what we normally do in class is kind of annotate this picture kind of collectively. I mean, if you're looking at this picture, this photograph that was taken under the Tsars, you can just see how backwards Russian agriculture was. You've got a horse there with a little tiny wooden plough. You've got a man there laying the seeds out of a bucket by hand. He's got holes on his jeans. I don't think they're the designer ripped jeans you lot have. There's no kind of machinery there, is there? There's no kind of industrialisation of agriculture. If we were to take a similar photo of this in, say, Britain at the time, showing farmers at work, there'd be much more kind of technology which they'd be using. So it was quite backwards, and therefore when thinking about the problems facing Russian peasants and agriculture, one really big issue was they could only really grow enough food to feed themselves. So the peasants, they call it subsistence farming, so the peasants could only grow enough to feed themselves, which meant that if you had like some bad harvests, poor weather conditions, anything of that nature, then hunger and starvation could quite quickly kick in. And so one of the main problems facing Russian peasants and agriculture was this idea that famine was almost kind of looming, or hunger was almost kind of looming, which again leads to further problems because you can't industrialise the country unless you've got enough food, because obviously industrial workers in cities don't grow food. So they rely upon those in agriculture in the rural areas to grow enough food to then feed themselves, obviously, and then also feed the cities as well. So agriculture in many ways was preventing industrialisation of Russia from taking place. Thinking back to when we did all that work in Alexander II, you've also got issues to do with the Russian army. So a lot of these peasants we can see here, perhaps a little bit can't even speak today, little lack of food. Okay, they probably didn't grow as strong as they could do. That led to problems for the army, for recruiting into the army. As we've already discussed previously, a lot of them had no or very little education, which again causes problems. And we should know from doing Alexander II work about all the issues we've got regarding the emancipation of the serfs, and the consequence of that, having to pay those redemptive payments for 49 years, for example, made the peasants gaining the worst land as well as a consequence of that deal. So there's all these kind of issues and problems which were facing the Tsars regarding the peasants. And I suppose another big issue is there's a lot of them. Russia's a very massive country and there are lots and lots of these peasants. I think one thing probably in favour of the Tsars regarding the peasants was they were very conservative with a small c. They didn't really like change, which could be a problem because they resisted kind of, new kind of technology and stuff that was introduced. But it also created problems. It also supported the Tsars because if you remember some of those radicals who went to the countryside, didn't they, trying to get them on side, and I discovered that the peasants kind of turned them all into the police. So we've got those issues regarding the peasants. Now for the rest of this page, he says, reminder from an earlier in the course, what's the role of the Mia in the village? So that is these village elders. And what's the role of the Zemstva in the villages? So again, look back to Alexander II stuff and then fill in those bits about the Mia and the Zemstva. And then the final box on this page is, what do you think was the main problem and why? So this is something from your own kind of judgment, if you like. What was the biggest problem facing the peasants and why was it a big problem? Okay, on the next page, it's looking at their living and working conditions, and again it's a very similar picture to what we've just seen in the previous thing as well. So you can see this picture I've put on this PowerPoint slide is in your booklet, and again there's lots of space around it because the idea is that we would annotate it together and talk about their living conditions. Now if you think about this photograph, they're all stood outside, look like they're in the firing line, doesn't it, a little bit? They've probably never seen a camera before. Someone's probably come from the city, I imagine, to take this photo. It's quite interesting about why it was taken in the first place. But they're probably in their Sunday best, so to speak. So this is their best kind of clothes which they've got. And you can see, I know it's not the best photo, but they look pretty grubby, don't they, some of them? So the bloke on the far right-hand side, I'm not sure whether it's the father of the household or something, but he's looking pretty grubby, I would say. The woman third from left as well, she looks pretty kind of grubby as well. And again, they've got very poor living and working conditions. Most of the Russian peasants lived in a single roomed house or hut called an izba, I-Z-B-A. They're usually built out of wood, they're usually built quite poorly, they're often quite damp. They'd have one kind of oven or fireplace inside these buildings, and often as well they share them with the animals as well, so you can see pigs or whatever in there as well. So again, you've got issues then, haven't you, with poo-poos, I suppose, from animals and wee-wee from animals and all the rest of it. So they sleep in that single room, they'd live in that single room. You can imagine it being filled with smoke, can't you, when they've kind of got the fire going or whatever. Got the pigs and the whatever else in there as well, chickens and stuff. So pretty kind of bleak conditions, and a lot of peasants in Russia did not live very long. And again, it was a hard life. We saw from the previous photo of them working the land, by hand. So they'd work all day on the land, which is quite a tough job. Poor housing conditions. There'd been not real kind of healthcare or anything of that nature. So again, life would be fairly brutal and short, I would have thought. I don't know how old these people are, but I bet the guy on the right who's the father house, he looks quite old, doesn't he? I bet he's not actually. I bet he's about my age, which he might be. It's quite old. Anyhow, so that's just to get you thinking about the living and working conditions of the peasants. And one thing you'll find that when we come on to looking under the communists is that actually most of the peasants at the beginning of the communist period are not actually in that much better conditions. It does begin to change in the 1930s to some extent, but again there's quite a few similarities going back then as well. Okay, so under the peasants, poor food production, it was hampering industrialisation, it was hampering the strength of the army, so to speak, which were kind of big concerns for the Tsar. Poor living conditions, which probably didn't bother the Tsar too much, obviously would if you were a peasant. Okay, so finally, what we're going to look at today is in 1891 there was a really big famine in Russia. There was an early frost which killed off a lot of the grain that they planted in autumn. There was then a period of drought, and you saw this period of famine in Russia. Okay, so you saw this period of famine in Russia. Sorry, I'm rushing in because it started to rain outside. And what I'd like to do is I want to do some reading from a book by Orlando Figs, he's called. I thought it was on Moodle, but I can't see it, so I will copy the pages for you. And what you need to do is to read the pages which I copy for you, and essentially you need to find out how did the government of Alexander III respond to this crisis? How did they act when this crisis took place? What was the view of the finance minister? I can't say his name, Ivan Vishnegradsky. Okay, and what does that tell you perhaps about how the government kind of perceived the peasants? And then what did the government actually decide to do in the 17th of November? What's really interesting about this family is the role of the Zemstva. And Orlando Figs kind of argues that this famine, I won't say doesn't trigger the rebellions and revolts that took place and the revolutions that took place, but he says it kind of gave a warning sign, if you like, of impending doom for the Tsarist period, I suppose. And what we'll discover is that when we look at Lenin and Stalin, they too faced famines, and it's quite a nice comparison you can make, which we'll look at when we do about those reigns, between how did Stalin and Lenin deal with their famines compared to Alexander III, and which of the rulers perhaps dealt with it the best, what were the similarities in how the three rulers dealt with famines and the differences. Okay, so I'll send an email, it'll have those pages on, there's a timeline which I want you to do as well. So the next video I'll probably upload at some point on Thursday, and we'll look at the reforms of Stolypin, which took place under Tsar Nicholas II.